All right. Hi, everyone. Let me get my screen set up here. And we'll get started. All right. So my name is Nikki Miller, and I serve on the leadership team for the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, and I also work at Shield, North Carolina. I'll be your moderator today. And then we'll have Nathan Prater as a presenter. He is the Vice President of Global Ethics and Compliance for Ahold Delhaize, an Amsterdam-based international food retailer. And there he leads the Global Ethics, Human Rights, and Product Safety team. Feel free to introduce yourself and enter your agency and location in the chat. If you have any questions for our presenter today, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then we will get to those questions at the end as we have time. So I want to take a quick second to explain the purpose of the Demand Reduction Task Force. Our vision is a state in which there is no demand for exploited persons. Our mission is to create and execute a comprehensive plan to reduce demand for services of exploited persons. And our goal is to launch effective demand reduction programs to address both labor and sex trafficking based on available evidence and best practices. Last year, we hosted a webinar series about sex trafficking and the role that demand plays in exploiting people for sex. And this year, our focus is on labor trafficking and the role that demand plays in exploiting people for labor. We have planned for you to meet a farmer that employs workers who are here with H-2A visas, and he has the same workers that return year after year. Unfortunately, something came up and he isn't able to join us today. However, we feel it's important for you to understand how the H-2A visa program works in order to have an appreciation for the labor involved in agriculture. So we are going to watch a conversation between a farmer and several of his H-2A workers who are about to leave that farm, having worked for a full season there.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the H-2A program. I've had the previous video and there's been a lot of commentary about the H-2A program, what it is and why people come here, how their situation is. I haven't talked to these guys up to now. I just wanted to bring them here because they have been here for the last 7-8 months and they're headed home. So I kind of wanted to see what their situation has been like, what they've learned, what they've liked, what they've disliked. And so you're going to learn that right along with me. If you like what you're seeing, you know what to do. Give us a like and subscribe and come back and see if you can keep learning about H-2A visas, agriculture in general, and what we do on the farm to get food on your table.
My name is Juan Pablo.
Okay. Samuel.
Okay.
Rafael Moncada.
Osvaldo Moreno.
Manuel Mata.
Edwin Martínez.
Ok, entonces ya los tengo aquí. ¿Han estado desde cuándo vinieron? ¿Octubre? ¿Noviembre?
Noviembre.
Octubre.
Noviembre
Ok. ¿Y para ustedes, era la primera vez que vinieron ustedes aquí a Estados Unidos o habían estado
Yo
antes?
sí.
¿Tú habías
vez.
venido antes?
No, primera
vez.
No, yo había venido.
Sí, sí había venido. ¿Todos los demás habían venido?
Sí.
Ok,
Ya.
no era siquiera la primera vez. Ok, entonces, Edwin, para ti, que era tu primera vez viniendo para acá, ¿qué era lo bueno y lo malo de tu experiencia trabajando en este programa con visa?
Lo bueno que pues poder ayudar a la familia, ya que ya no se puede. Y lo malo es dejarlos.
Ok, ¿y
Pues,
tienes niños?
sí, una bebé.
Un bebé. ¿De
Sí.
cuánto?
Cumplió
cuántos
9
años?
meses.
De 9 meses nomás. Wow.
Sí.
Entonces sí.
Tenía 3 cuando yo me vine
Ok, entonces alcanzaste a mirarlo,
Sí.
conocerlo antes de
a
venirte.
conocerla.
Ok.
Y espero dejarlos.
Eso tiene que haber sido muy difícil.
No, pues,
Y los demás es segunda, tercera. ¿Quién ha venido más veces que los demás?
Yo he venido ya 3 veces.
Las 3 veces, ok.
Yo vine 10 años, pero de mojado antes.
Ok. ¿Y cómo era tu experiencia diferente viniendo legalmente comparado que cuando viniste ilegalmente?
No, pues muy diferente porque pasa uno por la línea y antes tenía que cruzar el desierto 4 o 5 días.
Ok. Entonces es fácil venir ahora, ¿no?
Sí.
Los que están viniendo ahora nomás, ¿vinieron en avión, no? ¿O vinieron por autobús?
No, no, en
Por
avión
autobús.
En avión a Tijuana y de Tijuana para acá en la vez.
Entonces ya se ve la diferencia.
Sí.
Es normal, pues, cruzar la frontera y venir aquí a trabajar. ¿Si les da oportunidades económicas que no pueden obtener ahí en México?
sí.
Sí, demasiado.
Son
mucho.
las-
Demasiado.
Sí.
Muchísimo.
Pues hacer su casa,
Sí,
Sí, hacer-
comprarse algo que no se puede, por ejemplo, carro.
Un terreno, un terreno, una casa.
ayudarle a la familia, pues ya no es lo mismo.
¿Están ayudando a su familia
Sí,
también?
Sí.
¿Mandan dinero cada cuánto?
Cada cheque.
Cada
15 días.
cheque. Están mandando dinero para allá.
Sí.
Sí.
Aquí ganan, vamos a decir, $13.50 la hora, por
Ujú.
ponerlo fácil. Están dando $13.50, pero no tienen la renta,
Ujú.
no tienen que pagar no tienen que pagar sus biles.
Nada.
¿Cuánto comparado con lo que se pueden, lo que podrían ganar en México, cuánto ganan aquí comparado con allá?
Pues, ejemplo, lo de una hora aquí es allá lo de un día.
Pues el día completo.
Y
Una hora aquí es de
Ujú.
un día completo. ¿De
Ajá.
cuántas horas trabajando allá?
es de
6,
7 a 2.
7 horas, 6, 7 horas.
6, 7 horas.
Aparte de ver la familia cuando regresan, ¿qué es la cosa que quieren comprar al regresar a la familia, al regresar a su casa? ¿Tienen como una meta de algo que quieren comprar?
Sí.
Hacer
Sí.
su casa.
Hacer
su casa.
Despacito.
Despacio.
Eh,
Porque pues en México no se puede.
Si sigue viniendo la gente, pues construirla
Poco a poco.
poco a poco.
Poco a poco.
Ajá.
¿Y sería posible para ustedes construir una casa si no vinieran aquí a trabajar?
Oh, muy
No.
difícil.
No,
No,
muy
sí.
difícil.
No.
No se logra.
¿Es posible o no es posible?
No.
No es posible casi.
No.
No.
Ok. ¿Por qué no puede uno ganar lo suficiente?
No
para
ganan lo
hacerlo?
suficiente.
Sí, nada más lo al día uno.
Para estar comiendo nada más.
Sobrevivir, nada más.
Ok, la razón que hago estas preguntas, no, y a lo mejor no lo saben ustedes, pero muchos, más que nada los que son de aquí, nos miran a nosotros como empleadores
Ujú.
y ellos dicen que nosotros estamos aprovechándonos de ustedes,
Ujú.
que no estamos dándoles una oportunidad, porque tienen ese punto de vista de que están trabajando duros, porque el trabajo que hacen sí es duro,
Es
¿no?
duro.
Es duro, pero es bien recompensado.
Sí.
Sí, demasiado.
Para nosotros es
¿Qué
muy
más
bien.
ganan?
Muy bien.
Es muy bien recompensado porque aunque sea duro, pues en México también es duro y,
Todo el trabajo
y,
es duro allá.
y mal pagado.
Y mal pagado.
Duro y mal
Mal
pagado.
pagado.
Sí.
Ok. Necesitamos comunicar su situación y la oportunidad que eso se les brinda, ¿no? Venir aquí. ¿Qué es lo que dirían a los que se quejan del hecho de que están aquí? Los que dicen que están quitando su trabajo a otras personas, a los americanos, a los de aquí.
Pues si ellos dicen que les quitamos el trabajo, pero pues no creo que vengan a estivar ellos a andar en el espárrago. Son trabajos difíciles que ellos no
van a querer
lo
hacer.
hacen, no quieren hacerlo.
No quieren hacerlo.
Y como uno está impuesto a hacerlo allá, pues aquí pues, ya a uno no se le hace difícil.
Es parecido a lo que tienen que hacer
Es lo
allá.
mismo.
Sí,
no,
es lo
Sí,
mismo.
es lo mismo.
Cortamos espárrago allá, cosas pesadas también. Todo.
Cargamos cosas pesadas.
Desde mi punto de vista, la razón que quería entrevistarles antes de que salieran es para que también la gente pueda ver que es una ventaja, una oportunidad, tanto para nosotros como empleadores, como ellos de trabajadores. Nos dependemos nosotros de ellos y ellos de nosotros. Y todos ustedes que están mirando el video dependen de nosotros como rancheros también. Tenemos que poner la comida en sus platos y ellos están aquí para ayudarnos a hacer ese proceso. ¿Qué más como de comida? ¿Qué es la cosa que no se puede comer aquí? Que no es igual.
Sí.
¿Todo?
Las tortillas.
Porque para mí los tacos de aquí son buenos, pero no, comparado con allá no.
Las tortillas.
Las tortillas.
Las tortillas no hay como las de México.
Sí.
So as you guys can see, kind of an unscripted conversation with these guys, you can see and hear their point of view, the opportunity that it is for them. You'll have already seen where I said that this is an opportunity and an advantage for both of us, for the employer and for the worker. And we live in challenging times here from a labor standpoint as agriculturists, trying to find people willing, able to come to the fields and to do the work. And we do it with a financial advantage for these guys that are here, and so that we can continue to provide safe, secure food for you. It's not a perfect system, it never is. There's things that can be improved upon, there's things that can change, but it is a system that's worth understanding, and it's one of those rare moments when government involvement can still be can still work and still give opportunities and provide what it needs to. So
All right. So the H2A is a temporary agriculture program, and it allows workers such as the ones in the video to legally be brought into the U.S. to perform agricultural labor or services on a temporary or seasonal basis. Farmers depend on these workers for labor when they can anticipate a shortage of domestic workers. As you saw in the video, it can be mutually rewarding when the farmers treat the workers fairly. So one way we encourage farmers to treat their workers fairly is to reward them with business. The Fair Food Program does just that. So let's learn a little bit about that program.
So for 300 years in this country, there was really no such thing as fair food, meaning that there was no way to recognize from a consumer's purchases that workers were treated well. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, a movement started in California, led eventually by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, that morphed into the United Farm Workers Union. And people of a certain age, my age and above, can remember not eating grapes or lettuce in the 70s because of the nationwide boycotts against produce that wasn't picked fairly, that wasn't picked in those days by union members. Now, unions have been decimated all across the country. In the 80s and 90s, most of the union protections that were won by farm workers were rolled back. Farm workers have two things against them. Number one, in many states, most workers can't unionize without the fear of losing their job. In Florida, for example, it's a right-to-work state, which means euphemistically that if you decide to unionize, your employer can fire you just for that. In California, for example, they can't fire you because you're trying to organize a union. Secondly, according to the National Labor Standards Act that was set in 1938 by FDR, that set the minimum wage requirements for workers all across the country, farm workers were the exception. Farm workers and domestic workers were predominantly African American, and in order for FDR to pass that bill, he needed the support of the Southern Democrats, who refused to let their African Americans have the same rights that workers all across the nation were having. So farm workers and domestic workers were excluded from that. So fast forward to the present day and age. There are no unions. Farm workers aren't really protected by national labor laws. They definitely aren't entitled to overtime. And what that means is that for a consumer who's asking themselves, is my food fair? The answer 99.99999% of the time is either no, or there's no way to tell. My film Food Chains focuses on one small group of workers from Central Florida, Southern Florida really, called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Immokalee is a Native American word which means our home, and it's a little tiny labor camp in Southern Florida right next to Naples. And I call it a labor camp because it's got a wintertime population of 40,000 people when the harvest is in full swing. But there's no city council, there's no mayor, there's no real infrastructure in that city. And it's only 15 miles away from the richest zip code in America, Naples. So Immokalee is a labor camp. And in that little labor camp, some of the worst atrocities in this country have happened, from modern day slavery to sexual harassment to really horrific crimes in the field. But a little group called the CIW, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, created a program called the Fair Food Program. And that Fair Food Program is really the only program in the United States that absolutely guarantees that workers in the field earn more than sub-poverty level wages and are entitled to a complete spectrum of human rights guarantees.
All right. So you heard a little bit about that program.
They've gotten 12 major retailers.
And what I'd like to show you now is a short story from CNN about the difference working in on a fair food farm for a fair food farmer can make in the life of the farm workers.
"5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her 2 small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now, says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
Y el Señor me dice, si no haces por las buenas.
He told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming. This is agriculture. Agriculture has, from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work, has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food Program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food Program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
The most important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food Program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
Voy a trabajar libremente,
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amra Walker, CNN.
Yeah, what a great story there. So I want to show you the Fair Food website and their list of partners. I have to stop my screen share for a minute here and get to their, let's see, get to their website. Thought I had it pulled up. Let's try this one more time. There we go. Okay. So when this pops up for you, you'll see their website. It's and you can find this list at fairfoodprogram.org. You can see their partners. And I'll scroll through here pretty quickly, but I want you guys to get a glance of this. You'll see on the left column, that very first one, Ahold merged with Delhaize in 2016. And the new company, Ahold Delhaize, still participates in this program. And this is our presenter's company. So we'll hear from him in just a minute. As I continue to scroll through, you'll notice that North Carolina only has 2 farms as partners, and those are the sweet potato growers there, Watkins Farm and Bissett Farm. We encourage you to discuss this program with any farmers that you know and ask them to participate as well. All right, let's get back to my presentation. And like I said, you can find that at fairfoodprogram.org, and you can learn more about that program. All right, so now we're going to hear an example of a case when a farmer or his labor contractor exploited their farm workers.
North Carolina's agriculture industry requires thousands of migrant workers every year. Many of them come through the H-2A visa program. Through this program, 21,000 workers, most from Mexico, came to the U.S. in 2018. Thousands more work in North Carolina fields without a visa. All of them are vulnerable to labor trafficking.
The layperson's definition of labor trafficking would be where an entity or an individual uses physical force or non-physical means of coercion, like debt or threats of harm, or even fraud, false misrepresentation, to trick someone or trap someone into working against their will. I think in just focusing on sex trafficking, we're really doing North Carolinians a disservice for a host of reasons. There are a number of reports globally and nationally showing that by and far, labor trafficking is the majority of trafficking that's occurring in our world. But also because I think understanding labor trafficking and labor exploitation helps us to better understand how to investigate and prosecute sex trafficking. And when you leave those communities and you come to work in a foreign community where you might not know where the resources are, and you're living in a migrant labor camp, where an extraordinary number of aspects of your life are controlled by an employer, sometimes that makes you vulnerable to exploitation. And that can even lead to human trafficking.
Yo fui contratado por una persona en Florida y así como yo viajé a Norte Carolina.
So these farm workers were in their community in Fort Pierce, Florida, as the Florida agricultural season was wrapping up, and they responded to an ad that they saw recruiting migrant farm workers for work in North Carolina. And when they called, they were put in touch with the Baltazar family. The Baltazar family promised these farm workers, including our 2 clients, that they would have immediate work, ample job hours offered in cucumbers and tobacco. They would be provided housing free of charge with a labor camp kitchen where they could prepare and cook their own meals, and that they would be providing transportation to the job from Fort Pierce, Florida to North Carolina free of charge. And it sounded like an attractive offer to our clients, and so they accepted.
Todo venía pagado, nosotros no teníamos que pagar nada. Cuando los fuimos contratados, dijeron que teníamos cocina, pero ya cuando estábamos en el campamento, dijeron que nadie podía meter en la cocina, nadie podía usar. Venimos al campamento y éramos 35 personas y dijo que nadie tenía derecho de salir, de irse, y que teníamos una deuda de $200 por persona de raite de Florida a Norte Carolina, y que teníamos que pagar $9 de comida por cada tiempo de comida. Era un total de $18 diario de comida.
The meals that they were provided were not enough to sustain our clients, 2 adult men at that time. And so what they were doing also to supplement their meals was fishing in like a swamp that was behind the labor camp. And then they made a makeshift outdoor kitchen where they would cook this fish from the swamp nearby to supplement their meals. Their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., would be around the camp or in the fields, always armed, and he subjected them to armed bed checks when some workers tried to leave. The labor camp was set pretty far back from the public road, so you had to kind of drive through a little gate and then up a very long, sandy dirt path to get to the labor camp. And the worker barracks were in the back of the camp. And between the worker barracks and the road to get to the public road was where the traffickers, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., stayed. And so they stayed there so they could watch and make sure that the workers weren't trying to escape without paying this surprise transportation debt and their meal fees. So the workers that were housed in the camp were frustrated and concerned. They were now told that they could not leave without repaying a debt. They had, for this transportation fee, they had no way to repay the debt because there really wasn't that much work that was being provided to them. And they had mounting debt every day because they were locked out of the labor camp kitchen and had to pay their contractors for meals. And so you've got this pressure of this debt you now have to pay, and then mounting debt. You're thinking when the season really starts and there's a significant number of hours for me to work, all of my salary is then going to go to this debt, and I'm still going to be left with nothing. Some of the workers escaped, and there were several waves of workers escaping. And after workers escaped the first time, their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., rounded them up and, brandishing weapons and telling them that they were not allowed to leave without repaying their debts. And if they tried to leave, then they had bullets in their guns for them. Another group of workers left in the middle of the night, and I think they left in the middle of the night to prevent detection by the crew leaders, including Junior Baltazar. And when that happened, our clients, including Mr. Rivas, heard the gunshots and assumed that those workers were being shot at. And then Junior Baltazar entered their room, flipped the lights on in the middle of the night, holding a weapon, and had them counting off to see who was left in the camp. And this was very powerful and kept these workers, including our two clients, in that situation and made them think that they could not leave. They tricked them into sort of leaving the comfort of the community where they knew how to access things, and into taking this leap of faith and coming to work for them, in a different state, which happened to be North Carolina, to force them to work. We don't typically see force, fraud, and coercion in all of our trafficking cases. But this case certainly was an example where they employed all of those means to keep someone in the situation and with the intention of forcing them to work. We did ultimately, represented those workers to achieve a settlement with the migrant housing provider. And in that settlement, one of the provisions was that if they were going to be operating the camp for a certain period of time in the future, they had to install landline telephone in the worker barracks with a human trafficking poster that had information about human trafficking and the Polaris hotline number. Our clients had the benefit of working with some really amazing case managers. This was when we were just really at the cusp of forging relationships with professionals and other disciplines to serve human trafficking survivors. And so we were able to refer Mr. Rivas to a case manager in another state who helped him to stabilize. He's now been reunited with his family in a safe place, and has, through the help of the case manager and through his own power and drive, has been able to move on from this trafficking situation.
Que la gente es para trabajar, no es para que abusen de ellos, para que no es que lo traten mal, que la gente sea libre, que no sea esclavizada, porque nosotros inmigrantes venimos a trabajar duro, pero no nos gusta que los traten mal. Eso nomás quiero decirle a las personas que contratan gente, que tengan un poco de compasión con nosotros.
All right, so this is the type of behavior that reputable companies do not want in their supply chains. So for an example of a larger corporation that strives to give its supply chain, or to keep its supply chain free of exploitation, let's hear from Ahold Delhaize's VP of Global Ethics and Compliance, Mr. Nathan Prater. Nathan, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Nikki. It's good to be here. And so I think I'm supposed to ask you to transfer control of the slides to me so that I can flip through them. So while you're doing that, I will briefly introduce myself and just to give a bit more context on my role with Ahold Delhaize and a little more information about the company as well. Alrighty, and let me see if I can. Nikki, I do not seem to be able to advance the slides.
Okay, I think maybe Pam, if you could do that, but I can, if you want to tell me when to advance, I can do that for you.
Absolutely, yeah, and so we'll just do it that way. So that works. So if you look, go to the next slide, just a little bit about me. As Nikki said, I lead the Global Compliance and Ethics Program for Ahold Delhaize. Generally, I am located in North Carolina, specifically Salisbury, for those of you who are familiar with that part of the state. I, at the moment, am traveling for business, so I'm actually sitting in London, England. So it's a little bit later in the day over here, and I have a little bit of jet lag, so any misspeaks on my part are probably have something to do with that. My wife and I have 3 children. I did not give you pictures of them because they're all much better looking than I am. But 3 boys, they're all grown and pretty much out of the house at this point. When our children left, we started collecting animals. Our current collection is 3 goats, 2 cats, a dog, and a very angry rooster who has a few hens that he looks after. So that's life on the farm for us these days. If you go to the next slide, Nikki, there's a little bit about Ahold Delhaize. And for those of you who are from North Carolina, and I imagine most of you are, this may be a company that you're not familiar with or have not heard about before. We are an international retailer, food retailer. We operate retail grocery stores under 19 different brands globally in 11 different countries, primarily in the eastern half of the US and Europe, with also some operations in Indonesia. Our business has been around for about 150 years. Both the Ahold and the Delhaize side of the business Delhaize started in Brussels, Belgium, about 150 years ago, and Ahold, under the name of Albert Heijn, started in the Netherlands a little over 100 years ago. So we have a long legacy of in close partnership with the local communities where we live and work. We have about 7,600 stores globally that employ about 414,000 people, and 60 million people a week come through our stores. So we have the opportunity to touch a lot of lives and impact people both near where we work and live, but also in our supply chains. Our goal or our purpose is to eat well, save time, live better, and enable our customers to do that through the products we sell. The next slide, though, gives you a little bit of an overview about a company that you're probably much more familiar with if you're from North Carolina or anywhere in the U.S., and that's Food Lion. So Food Lion is one of the kind of the leading brands within Ahold Delhaize. For those of you who know anything about the history of Food Lion, you know its North Carolina roots. It was founded here in Salisbury in 1957. Currently operates over 1,100 stores in 10 states, employs 82,000 people, and has about 10 million customers per week come through its stores. Food Lion does some amazing stuff in the community, not only just being a great place to shop, but through their Food Lion Feeds program, they've provided over 500 million meals to people in need, and they have just recently created a new goal once they cross the 500 million threshold of 1 billion meals. And so it's pretty amazing what the company has been able to do through the partnership with its customers. There's also a big emphasis on local products. And as any of you who have been in a Food Lion store probably have walked through the produce section and seen the various references to local farms where some of those vegetables and fruits are grown. And so that is a big part of our appeal in the communities where we work, not only in the Food Lion brand, but in other brands that we operate. So let's talk a little bit about kind of why we're here. If we'll go on to the next slide, Nikki, the problem that we're here to talk about is something that if you're here and listening, you're probably already familiar with. There's nothing that I need to do to convince you that human trafficking and forced labor is an issue. But I do think it does help to kind of focus a little bit on just the scale and the magnitude of this issue. So if you go to the next slide, these are just some recent headlines. And my background is a lawyer. I practiced in a law firm for about 11 years before going in-house about 17 years ago. And as a U.S. trained lawyer, and some of you on the call may be as well, but I did a lot of litigation, and my view was that we're a nation of laws. We have good protections for workers, and generally speaking, and I did a lot of employment litigation, and helped both companies and plaintiffs in those situations. But over more recently, I've had a really kind of fascinating journey of better understanding some of the abuses that occur in our in states and communities that we would think ought to not have these kinds of issues. And that's true not only here in the U.S., but in a lot of other places in the world. The Netherlands, where our headquarters is, is a country that by European standards is very progressive, very kind of law and order focused. But even in places like that, in smaller European countries, where you would not expect to find these types of issues, it's there. The next slide, though, I think is the one that really makes this real for me. Behind every one of these news stories, behind every one of these statistics, there are real people. And you don't necessarily need to read the fine print here. These are 3 different situations where people found themselves in precarious positions through their employment. The last one there was a miner who was killed while working in a processing plant. And I think it's important that all of us remember, whether whatever role we play in trying to prevent human trafficking, that at the end of the day, it really is about the people who are impacted by this. And speaking of people, the next slide is some information from the Mekong Club. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a organization based in Asia that does some really great work around human trafficking. Matt Friedman leads that organization. If you ever get a chance to hear Matt speak or read one of his books, you walk away from that experience, I think, with a totally different perspective on this issue. But by their estimates, there are over 40 million people currently in modern slavery. And while you think that this is a problem that we ought to be getting better at in terms of preventing it and eradicating it, it actually has increased over recent years. And that's primarily due to some of the global conditions around COVID, financial issues, war, immigration patterns. And so this is actually a bigger problem today than it probably ever has been in history before. And that doesn't, in one way, doesn't make sense, because we live, I think probably as everyone would agree, in a very divided society. We disagree about everything. You can get on Facebook or Twitter and you can get the latest on whatever the latest controversy is. But in my experience, every single person that I talk to about this issue of human rights generally, or more specifically human trafficking, agrees that this ought not to happen. Like, this is not something that ought to be going on in our world, and yet it does continue to occur all around us. So what can we do? So, Nikki, if you'll go on to the next slide, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how we approach this issue from a global retailer's perspective, and understanding that we literally have tens of thousands of suppliers from all over the world. So our supply chains extend to many, many countries in just about every continent, and it's complicated. I would say in order to provide products for the 60 million people a week that come through our stores, that requires very complex and extended, in some cases, supply chain. So we really began focusing on this issue about 6 or 7 years ago. So the merger between Ahold and Delhaize occurred in 2016. Following that, we began to put together sort of an updated code of ethics, and we recognized the need to really be more formal in our position on human rights. And so we, at that time, published our position on human rights, which honestly says all of the things you would expect a big company to say about these things. We don't tolerate it. We support, human rights and all of those things. And we meant all of it. But what we found was that we weren't always having the impact that we wanted to have. And so in 2018, we undertook a global due diligence process focused on human rights. We issued a human rights report with a lot of those findings in 2020. And then we continued to build that program out up until today, and that work is still ongoing. We have recently just kicked off an update to our due diligence process, and we're really looking for opportunities to further embed that in the business. We have found that in order to really make progress on this issue, to have the most positive impact that we can, it has to be a part of everybody's job every day, no matter where they are in the company. So that's what our current focus is how do we really drive internal engagement. If you go on to the next slide, this gives you a bit of a sense of where we saw our priorities coming out of that due diligence process. And there are 12 priorities there. The 6 on the inside were kind of the more critical priorities to us. You'll see that one of those was forced labor, and closely related to that was child labor. So even though it was on the outside, of the kind of the priority list, we felt like forced labor and child labor were very closely related. And so we pulled those together and have really been focusing on those in really kind of a singular way. Going on to the next slide then. So what we wanted to do was to take sort of these global aspirations and commitments that we had and really drive those out into our brands. We have 19 brands, and the reality is that's where most of the real activity happens in our company. That's where products are bought, that's where customers are serviced, that's where stores are built and operated. And so we really believe that the most effective way for us to do it is not as a global retailer, but as 19 individual local brands who have a vested interest in their communities. And so in order to do that over about an 18-month period, we really dove deep into each of those brands. And I can tell you, if any of you who have worked in the corporate world probably understand the feeling that people get when you present them with a new project. And it seems like the corporate environment is just one project after another, just more to do, always more to do. And we really expected to get some pushback or resistance when we started this process, because we thought, well, the brands will just look at this as just one more thing that they have to do. And the reality is we were overwhelmed, I think, by the sense of engagement that our brands had in this topic. And not just human trafficking, but human rights as a whole. And so we were really able to identify some really great work that was already being done in those brands. But we also found some areas and gaps that we thought we could do a bit better on. And so going on to the next slide, then, that was really what we wanted to do. We looked at our salient issues, and those are those priority issues, those 12 things. And we found 27 case studies that really not only highlighted some of the good that we were doing, but also established some internal best practices for our other brands. So here are things that we can do, that we can leverage, and that we can really have a positive impact. And that's, one of the challenges that we have is there's never enough time, there's never enough resources, and there's way too many issues to address. If you think about the kind of the universe of human rights issues, if you look at just the 12 salient issues that we identified, there's, these issues will be there when I retire. And that's looking like it's longer and longer off these days. But this work never ends. And so how then do you make the choices as a company on where to focus, where to kind of spend your energy and your resources? And one of the ways, and really the primary filter that we use, is we really want to spend our time working on things where we can have the most impact. We don't have time to waste effort where there's no return on that. We really need to identify things that have real impact on these salient issues that we've identified. So how then do we do that? And basically, this next slide, actually, Nikki, if you'll just go ahead and jump 2 slides. So what are we doing? But this is our strategy. This is how we think about this work. And this really, I think, is the meat of my presentation. And I would also say, to the extent that you have questions, I know I'm going through this pretty quick, but I'm happy to, if you want to put your questions in the chat, I'll look at those here as soon as I take a breath and stop talking here in a few minutes. But our strategy really focuses on 4 pillars. And the first is supplier accountability. We can't really have much of an impact at all if we don't look at our supplier community. The examples that you heard about earlier in this webinar all are things that occur in supply chains. And that's not to say that this couldn't ever happen in one of our stores or one of our distribution centers. That's certainly possible, but we have a lot more visibility into those things. We have very strict controls and processes to prevent that. And if it were ever to occur, it would be quickly dealt with. It's out in our supply chains, though, where the real risk of these types of human rights abuses occur. So how then do we hold our suppliers accountable? And one of the first ways is through contractual requirements. We have, in all of the contracts with our suppliers, we have obligations that they follow the law, that they respect human rights. And we have what we refer to as our standards of engagement. But this is it's a document that's based on an Amphori code of conduct. For those of you who are familiar with sort of the human rights environment more broadly, you'll be familiar with that. But it's a set of human rights expectations and social compliance issues that we expect all of our suppliers to comply with. And not only our direct suppliers, but we expect them to uphold those same values and expectations throughout their supply chains, going all the way back to the farm or the fishing vessel or the manufacturing facility where those products originate. And then we also have a process of social audits. Now, as you can imagine, with literally tens of thousands of suppliers, we don't have the opportunity or the ability to audit every one of those. So what we have done is we use the Amphori high-risk country designation list, and we require that all suppliers in high-risk countries have to have a valid and current social audit for their process, whatever that is, if it's a manufacturing facility or if it's a farm. And we monitor those, and we have certain what we refer to as deal breakers. So any instances of reported child labor, forced labor, or significant safety or health issues, we have the ability to immediately terminate the relationship with those suppliers. We also recognize, though, that sometimes terminating a relationship with a supplier is almost the worst thing to happen for those people who are somehow being taken advantage of or mistreated. And so we also have an improvement process where if the supplier will commit to making improvements to stopping whatever the bad thing is that they're doing, that there is an opportunity to continue. And we really feel like that's a way that we can have positive impact rather than just cutting them off completely and leaving them to someone else who might not have a similar concern. The other thing that we do to create supplier accountability is we support an internal whistleblower line. We refer to it as the speak up line. In the human rights world, we think about this as a grievance mechanism. I will admit, though, it's challenging to get that information out to all of the various locations where our products are picked or gathered or manufactured. So we also work closely with some industry groups who have grievance mechanisms and reporting capabilities. And we really view sort of those industry groups as probably the best way going forward to most effectively provide grievance mechanisms and speak up opportunities for workers. The second pillar of our strategy is collaborative partnerships. We recognize that we can't do this alone. And we also know that there are a lot of good organizations and other companies out there working to make progress and have a positive impact on these issues. You've already heard about the Fair Food Program, so we have been a participant in the Fair Food Program since about 2015. And we believe that there are times when those worker-driven programs are a significant kind of change agent, if you will, in terms of the dynamic between the farm owners and farm workers. There are other collaborative partnerships that we engage with both on an industry level. So the Consumer Goods Forum has a number of different projects and initiatives related to human rights. There are other more specific commodity type organizations that we belong to. But one of the most interesting partnerships that I think that we have currently is with a company called Tony's Chocolonely. And this is a product, it's chocolate bars that you may have seen. They've made their way to the US here in the last several years. You can't yet get them in any of our stores here in the US, as far as I know. You can at places like REI. I believe Target has Tony's Chocolonely. But Tony's Chocolonely is a Amsterdam-based chocolate company that started about 20 to 25 years ago. And the sole purpose of their existence was to create a chocolate program that was socially compliant. There was no child labor, no forced labor, no human trafficking in that supply chain. And they work very closely through co-ops and farms. And I've had the opportunity to meet with the folks at Tony's before and learn more about their story. Not only do they manufacture their own product, but all of our operations in Europe, our private brand or own brand chocolate is manufactured by Tony's Chocolonely. So we have a great relationship with them. But they estimate that even after 20 years of very focused, kind of efforts to clean up the supply chain, and paying premiums, doing, all of the things you have to do to fix this issue, they still estimate that as much as 7% of the cocoa that comes into their supply chain in some way involves child labor or forced labor. And you say, well, that's 7%. That's a lot. And the reality is they respond to it, they deal with it when they see it. But even after 20 years, there's still 7%. What's interesting, though, is they estimate that in just normal chocolate from other big chocolate companies, and those are obvious. I'm not here to name names, but it's estimated that in the overall cocoa supply, that as much as 40% of cocoa in some way involves child labor or forced labor. So 7% is a lot better than 40%, but I think it underscores the magnitude of the issue in just one product, one commodity, cocoa beans, how difficult it is to really eradicate these issues. The last two things quickly: understanding our supply chain. So we currently, as I mentioned, have a due diligence project going on. Part of that involves mapping our supply chain, and there's some real benefits to that. We conduct impact assessments on either specific commodities or regions, high-risk products. We've looked in the last couple of years, for example, you heard about the CIW, which was largely initially related to tomato pickers in Florida. There were similar issues in Italy. So we've done some work around tomato farming in Italy and blueberries in Spain, and just a number of different examples where we dig and do a deep dive within our supply chain. But then really, and maybe most importantly, is we want to educate people about this, both internally. We want people to understand internally what the significance of these issues are, but also through external advocacy. So we're very involved in some of these organizations that we have collaborative partnerships with. And we're happy to talk about this issue and the way that we see it improving to anyone who will listen. We really think that the more people understand about it and the ways that they can individually help and have an impact, the more difference we'll be able to make. The next slide, just two very quick things, and I'm about out of time, so I'll move pretty quickly. But this really, I think, is the future of product tracing and supply chain mapping. This is something that technology is enabling that we really didn't even have 10 years ago. And so several of our brands are piloting programs. You can go to our Albert Heijn brand in the Netherlands. If you buy fresh orange juice, you can type in the UPC code, and literally you can track it back to the farm where those oranges were picked. And we really believe that level of supply chain transparency is desirable. But the reality is that's probably years off for most of the products that we track and that we manage, just because of the complexity of the issues. And I think that we're not unique in that respect. That's a challenge for the entire industry. The next slide just gives you a brief overview of our goals on social compliance. So this is the auditing and compliance process that we were talking about. Our goal is that by 2025, all 100% of our suppliers of own brand products in high-risk countries would be audited against an acceptable standard. We're working hard towards that. I will tell you, one of the challenges, though, is the more we learn about our supply chain, the more we recognize opportunities and we find new things. And so the work is continuing more than ever, but the more we work, the more we find that we need to work on. So that's a bit of a challenge in that respect. The next slide, actually, just that says conclusion. Just jump on to the next one. This is really where I see it at the moment. There's a lot of legislation. Those of you who are familiar with some of the CSRD and other related legislation coming out of Europe, the German Supply Chain Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, there's a lot of activity. What we find, though, is that legislation often requires a lot of reporting. It requires a lot of resources that actually don't have much impact. And so while we believe transparency is great, we would rather spend that time and energy on really making a difference and improving the situation. But we also believe that legislation can be an important driver in changing behavior. The landscape of external stakeholder expectations is complex and increasing. And what that means is there's a lot of issues out there that really are demanding our attention. The reality is resources are limited, and while respecting human rights is a clear priority, it isn't the only priority. You look at some of the environmental issues, scope 3, scope 2, scope 1 emissions, greenhouse gases. I mean, just the deforestation. There are just a ton of issues that we have sitting in front of us that we're trying to work on. So what we believe is the best way to do to really drive change in these things is to make it an integrated part of our business process. This is not just one function or one team in the company working on this. This is everyone who touches these topics or these areas being involved, being aware, and being engaged on how to make a difference for good. So that's it in terms of my my slides, and I will take a quick look at the. I don't see any. Actually, I do see a couple of questions. Yeah. So okay. So Whole Foods has Tony's chocolate only. Yeah, that's. I'm not suggesting that you go to Whole Foods to buy it. But I am saying it's really good chocolate. So I think if you can go there to buy the chocolate, that's all. For everything else, you need to go to Food Lion. And then Pam mentions that, can you discuss whether the suppliers of your suppliers are audited and how are they monitored? Yeah, so we have so the definition that we use for own brand products and when audits are required is we go back to the last stage of production. And so this is particularly relevant in the kind of the fruit and vegetable industry here in the US. A lot of the products that you buy, and avocados are a good example, right? So you buy avocados, they're probably they're probably grown in Mexico. Many of our avocados come from there, but the greatest likelihood is that they are probably packaged, put together in New Jersey, for example. We're not, we're concerned about what's happening in New Jersey, but that's not really where the real risk is. And so we go back to what we call the last stage of production, which for fruits and vegetables is actually where those products are harvested from. And so, yes, if that activity occurs in Mexico, Mexico is a high-risk country, all of those farm suppliers are required to participate in an audit process. So it's not perfect. But we think it really gets to the bulk of the risk there. So
I've got a couple of questions, Nathan, that came through. One of the questions, I'm going to be selfish for a second and ask it. It's my question. So you mentioned that there are several countries that are high risk, and what are those countries, and what products do they make, so that we could be on the lookout and make sure that we're buying. It's really interesting that you mentioned the chocolate. I will definitely be looking for that. But are there any other or any high-risk countries, and what products do they make?
Yeah, so I don't know the full list. It's pretty lengthy. I think that countries are what you would expect them to be, though. So North Korea, China, several countries in the Middle East, a number of the Central American countries, and a lot of countries in Africa, and along with some other, other countries. Typically, the high risk aspect is dependent upon sort of how mature their legal systems are. So if those countries don't have strong legal protections for workers, then that's generally what triggers the high risk designation. And again, that's not to say that these things can't happen in low risk countries. I mean, you look at what's going on in the United States and some of the stories that we've seen in the national news in just the last 6 months, and it's very depressing, and that ought not to be, and it's illegal, but it still happens. So that's how we look at that.
Okay, another question is, as you look across your global supply chain, what are the biggest factors that drive human trafficking?
Yeah, I think it's evil people and greed. I mean, I think in terms of that's what drives all this, right? The profit. The Mekong Club has done some really interesting analysis on the money derived from human trafficking, and then you compare that to the law enforcement kind of investment in stopping it, and they're not even close to equal. But I do think in recent years there have been a couple of global developments that have impacted this issue that we've seen in our own operating areas. So the war in Ukraine, for example, there are a number, many thousands of Ukrainian refugees spreading across into Western Europe. And those are people that are vulnerable to being taken advantage of. So we see that in migrant worker situations. We see it, some of the examples in the videos that you shared earlier are examples where people come for economic opportunity and then are taken advantage of and abused. So we think that is one. The second thing that we have seen a big shift is just the sort of the economic instability in parts of the world due to COVID and the lack of opportunity. So that has been a game changer, I think, in terms of labor availability. The farmer that did the video blog that you played about the H-2A program, labor is a huge issue, and it's become even worse in the last couple of years. So that creates even more vulnerability. So I think those are issues at the macro level that quite frankly companies will never be able to fix. That I think requires countries to really step up and take some responsibility on some of these issues.
Right. So our next webinar is going to be about what North Carolina as a state can do to address labor trafficking. What do you, and I'm sorry, I put you on the spot. If you don't know, you can just say, but what are some things as a state that we can do, or legislation you think that might need to be discussed?
Yeah, I think the fact that farm workers are exempt from so many of the labor protection laws at the national level is an opportunity for states to step up. It's a very complicated issue because there's a whole economy around farms that is kind of built on a current labor model, but that labor model is outdated. It goes back to the family farms when child labor was your 6 kids working on the farm, not people from other countries coming in at the age of 14 or 15. So we have to, I think, modernize our laws, and that's a very difficult task because there's a lot of economic factors at play there. But I think that is certainly one thing. And I think also just at the state level that something that we can do is just to create more awareness. And I know that's what your organizations do. I think the more people understand, the more just average individuals understand this, the more they can, number one, be on the lookout for it, but also they can make choices in terms of as consumers, where they buy, where they put their money, that can help I think change behaviors and expectations as well.
All right, and then you talked about things being outdated and getting more modern. What are there any kind of like emerging technologies that we can use to help fight this?
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, blockchain was going to solve everything. In from a traceability perspective, I think that was a little bit overhyped at the time, but it is beginning to pay off. The orange juice tool, the tracking tool we have, is based on blockchain technology. I think that is one. I think, interestingly, social media in that sense has made a huge impact because things that we never used to see, we now see. There's a lot more transparency. So while that's not necessarily a technological development, I think it's something that it is a way that technology is being used to bring more more the light of day into some of these issues that people were it was kind of easy to ignore even 10 or 15 years ago.
So, all right, so my last question, let me double check and make sure there's no more. Yes, okay, so the last question is there anything that you want to leave with us? What would that be? Any last comments?
Yeah, I think, and I don't know, I haven't had a chance to look at the participant list. I have no idea who's listening, where you're from. I suspect that, the people who are listening are interested and are already in some way involved. But, I think that all of us, even if we're involved in this topic professionally, I think there's a personal level of engagement here that we ought to individually look for and try to find. What are the ways that we can make a difference, not through our organization, not through the company we work for, but like what can we do personally to make a difference in these areas? And so I think that's been a bit of a challenge for me over the last 12 months or so. One of the things that I'm doing is we're starting a pro bono program. So we have lawyers, we have, probably 250 lawyers that work for the company all over the world. And we're setting up a pro bono program that's focused on human trafficking. And so making ourselves available to organizations, not only here in the US, but around the world that have, a lot of involvement in these types of issues. So I think, finding ways to make a difference on a personal level is something that's important. And I would hope everyone tries to do that and looks for that opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nathan. It's been very insightful. I'm so impressed with all that your company is doing. And thank you for making sure that the suppliers are held accountable with respecting workers' rights. So thank you.
Okay.
I am going to share my screen once more, and we will wrap this up here. Let's see. All right, let's sorry about that. We'll get to the end. All right, so I did want to remind everyone that next week is Thanksgiving, so we'll be taking that week off, and then the week after that, we are going to be hearing from different panelists about the things that we can do as a state. So there we go. There it was. All right, so those of you if you want to scan that QR code to register for session 4, you can do that. So far in the series, we've talked about labor trafficking and supply chain transparency in broad terms. And then we've heard from 3 survivors who shared their perspective of labor trafficking. And then today, of course, Nathan Prater, the ethics director of Ahold Delhaize, discussed their efforts to keep the supply chain from including exploited labor. So we look forward to seeing you on that last day in November. If you're interested in joining the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, please reach out to us, and you can do that by emailing us at coordinator@ncdemandreduction.com. And a little teaser before I let you guys go, the Demand Reduction Task Force will be holding a 2-day prevention conference on May 1st and May 2nd of next year. So mark your calendars, and you'll be hearing more about that as the time approaches. So thank you guys for joining us today. It's been a pleasure learning with you, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.